going to be talking about some Georgist ideas, which are going to be fun. I'm going to have fun getting Martin's comments on this, but specifically the AFFEERCE Georgist movement, AFFREECE, AFFEERCE.org if you want to, AFFREECE.org. Something I just came across about a week and a half ago and have had a lot of fun just learning about. There's definitely lots of really cool things that I'd love to talk with Martin about today and share. And anyone who has comments or ideas or interest in any of these things, feel free to contact me or contact us at any time. So to jump right in, Martin, did you have a chance to read through much of the articles I sent at all, or should I just start from the beginning, I guess?
Well, I think it's generally better every time if you explain it to not just me, but also the audience. I think that works quite well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. So let's just start with the Georgist movement a little bit. So anyone who is familiar with Henry George, philosopher and economist of about 150 years ago, wrote one of the biggest pieces of his time, Progress and Poverty. It was really all about land value taxes and how pretty much any tax except for a land value tax is an evil tax. And that we should try to kind of transition all of our world taxes away from evil taxes like income taxes that make people not want to work and want to work less, towards just taxing the land, which is kind of a shared common resource of everyone in the world. And on top of that, I think he also included like pollution taxes, to some extent consumption taxes, any kind of common material that people are using to make money. That's what we can tax. Anything above that, as far as your personal labor, your personal efforts, even your own intellectual property, all of these things in general should not be taxed at all, because it's a product of your labor and you should have full entitlement to 100% use your own personal, income and labor for free enterprise and freedom as much as possible. So that in a concept, I think, is a very good one that was very, very popular at the time, about 150 years ago, but never really took off for, I think, various reasons. The kings of the time and the leaders of the time thought it was bad. They liked their income taxes for whatever reason, and income taxes as a whole have evolved a lot over the last even 100 years. Since World War I, World War II, they've really kind of skyrocketed, where they at first they were maybe 5 or 10%, where in most of the civilized world now it's getting close to 50, sometimes 60, 70% once you get into higher income brackets. So it's changed a lot over the years. But the point is that this Georgist movement is still around and still fairly strong, although it never really took off and never really went mainstream anywhere. But that's kind of what they are standing for. And they have like conferences all the time. Definitely check them out anytime. Henry George, the Georgist movement. There's lots of them online that are constantly talking about ways that they can move the world towards these land value taxes and move away from all the other evil taxes. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that in general, Martin? Have you followed Henry George much in the past or heard much about this Georgist movement?
I may have heard about it from somewhere a little bit because I've studied political science, and these are the kinds of topics that somehow, somewhere, somebody, I'm sure, mentioned, especially since Marxism or like something that's usually perceived as un-American type of stuff, but also a very American type of stuff. It's supposed to be something like we don't like taxes being a big political issue in general. It's just I'm more familiar with the general sort of liberal, as you would say, American liberal attitude, which is basically like, or libertarian type movement, which is generally against taxes or the sort of governments in general. I'm not sure I have heard specifically like these are the good kinds of taxes theory and these are the bad kinds of taxes theory too much. But of course, I have actually debated and seen debated various tax-related issue over the years, since I've been part of the debating program and various international debating competitions for like 20 years now or more. So that gets debated, and specifically income tax gets debated a lot, like its merits or demerits, to use a technical term. So I think the main criticism of the income tax that I've heard repeated the most often would be something like there's actually a kind of an Ouroboros type thing, like the snake eating its own tail type stuff. And that's sort of, I'm actually personally very interested in all kinds of arcane stuff, as you know, but this is like the most arcane, hard to understand type of stuff for me in my brain, because my brain doesn't do finance very well. And if you say something like this and then I try to think about it, then it sort of just freezes my brain at some point. So like where the money actually goes, and like then you realize it, but wait, all of the money it's like just created out of nowhere. So what does it even mean if you like run out? And just again, there's just sort of these kinds of things, like kinds of thoughts hurt my brain.
Yeah.
And but I have heard a lot of sort of arguments for lately that we should just move on to something like something like flat taxes, but specifically like the I think VAT type taxes, the sort of consumption taxes, or that basically you're not. I think because like the other debate would be, of course, if you have income tax, then should it be stratified, and or how? Like if you have it at all, then there's this whole issue, which actually in the Czech Republic or in the area around here, that's most debated usually. If you're in the post-communist states, the big question basically never is that we like whether we should have an income tax. The big question is if we have it, then like how, and not even like whether it should be flat or stratified, but how stratified exactly it should be. Because that's sort of the thing that the democratic socialist parties and communist parties, which are very strong, or I guess used to be, now it's a bit iffy, strong in this area, usually focus on a lot, because you want to be more, and I always forget the maxims, especially in English, like you have the socialist maxims, like from everyone to everyone based on, and I always forget which is which.
From everyone based on their ability to everyone based on their need.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of the socialist
I have
one.
Yeah, that's the, and I definitely have some major problems with that, obviously, because of, it just really makes people who are working not want to work. And anything that kind of encourages people, because it's kind of being stolen from them essentially. And like I got big into the Ayn Rand stuff a little bit at one point, and I've kind of moved past it now. But it's definitely an interesting theory of, if you tax people enough, too much, eventually all your producers, all your smart and intelligent people that are producing the most, will leave society or just stop working, move off to an island somewhere. And you're left with just lazy bums that with no producers.
Well,
and
I would say there might be some potential for disagreement between us finally, a little bit, but that's what I imagine is the very North American and very anti-post-communist sort of perspective on taxes. So our regions are very different, I think, and sort of in the default. And also, every time anybody starts explaining Ayn Rand to me, it sounds, I always like picture Fallout and Bioshock, and this like type of like very American single industrialist going crazy and building their like society from the ground up type sort of dystopias. And but I actually very much respect what's his name. There's one relatively famous. Yeah, I remembered, Michael Malice, like sort of Ayn Randist and libertarian, I guess. Do you know Michael Malice?
I don't know him, no.
I very much recommend him. I think he's like the best sort of proponent of that whole philosophy, who even like sort of rehabilitated it for me. In especially how he seems to be like a genuinely great person, like great as in good person, like with tons of integrity, which you don't actually see very often with like the sort of leading proponents of ideologies. And precisely this ideology is very much like sort of anti sort of centralized government ideology. So he even wrote he wrote a great book about North Korea, where he's been actually in person about North Korea. It's called Dire Rieder. This is like a joke, like a play on words with like dear leader, and sort of the inability of pronounce L and R sounds correctly. It's like it's funny, but also like he's a friend of the one of the most intelligent podcaster. Just don't, my brain doesn't do names. Joe Rogan's friend, the Joe Rogan's friend, who's a AI scientist who has the very famous podcast, Lex Fridman. Right, I can remember. So it takes a bit of work, but I can remember names. So Lex Fridman is his friend. Michael Malice is Lex Fridman's friend, and so he's frequently on his podcast. And so he's like sort of very much, for me, I guess, the sort of best intellectual proponent of that whole sort of philosophical viewpoint. That's sort of actually very much focused, the way I understand it now, on individual excellence and individual integrity. And in that way, well, it's not exactly anarchist, I would say. It's actually, there are points that resonate with me now, and I think taxes are sort of a sticking point between these very individualist philosophies and what's commonly implemented, like the laws that are normally implemented or customs that are normally implemented in the world, especially like the taxes in particular, because that's like sort of a intersection of like that's where government as like a sort of a normally nebulous entity like reaches in an individual's pocket and takes their money type stuff, which is like a very unpleasant and specific point of like intersection between the government and the individual. So I can imagine, I do understand why it's such a hot button issue. For me, when I think of questions of economy, I always want to have some sort of a scientific solution, and then you always run into the problem that like at some level you can't actually like calculate which approach exactly is better by how much exactly in
Sure,
which
sure.
specific circumstances. So you
Okay.
have to have sort of a little bit of faith, and you have to sort of exercise your choice, a little bit of preference. And so it's just generally a bit irritating to me, but I think I do understand where that philosophy is coming from, and I do respect a lot of it now, thanks to Michael Malice.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely check out Michael Malice. Maybe we can talk about him again in a future podcast. For today, interest of time anyway, I wanted to just kind of dig into some of these ideas with you a little bit more. I'll try to keep them really kind of simple as much as possible. But I think you mentioned earlier, as far as, with the economy and currency and all these different ways of trying to tax people, where you got the snake eating itself. And if you just kind of think of all money as a store of value, where you're just, whether you consider it food or land, buildings, infrastructure, it's all just kind of stored value to use later to eat and entertain ourselves at the end of the day. So if you think of currency equals stored value in general, it's not something we create. We create value by working, or by taking advantage of the land and extracting resources, or hiring people to work for us, right? So there's all these different, if you kind of think of it as that concept, it's usually a little easier to simplify anyway, as far as what kind of actions do we want people to do to create value so that everybody can be more prosperous, and what kind of actions do we kind of want less of. Whether it's sin taxes or pollution taxes, or just negative consumption style of taxes. So I think that's really what we're kind of talking about now, is what's the best way to influence good.
Yeah, so now I remembered where I actually wanted to go with my argument. I wanted to give an example of the main counter argument from my part of the world and from the more socialist perspective. And you can see it working actually reasonably well in many countries here, or maybe more so in like the Nordic countries in the north of Europe, is that they have like, especially the Scandinavian countries, have pretty high taxes. And they sort of do with that money what sort of an ideal state should ideally do within the theory of what that's supposed to be for. And they can achieve some good results with it. And in large part, even in the Czech Republic, of course, there's always the corruption or the inefficiency of the government and all these sort of like mitigating factors to how good it could be in practice. But sort of the theory would be that, like you would say, from the perspective, sort of the Randist perspective, it would be that people wouldn't want to work, because especially if the tax is higher, as like you make more and more money, and so it's gradually more demotivating, and sort of in that vision, these sort of excellent people who are these sort of who make business and create jobs and all these sorts of like mythological things that are attached to it. So it's like it's great if they do more, because the more they do, the better off everyone is. But then there's of course this sort of criticism that like, but if it's collected by the government, who's like sort of has some sort of mandate given like by people to like actually do stuff that's helpful to people, then they will spend a lot of that money, especially if it's something like a peaceful pacifist country, generally like Germany. So they wouldn't even spend a lot on armies or stuff that's like in America is like the big issue, that it's being all spent wrong. So you have countries where it's not all spent wrong, where actually most of it is spent kind of right. Even if you're like sort of individualist, libertarian, and have some issues with all kinds of aspects of government, it's still like many governments will use it here, around here especially. They will actually use it to, I don't know, build entertainment, recreational facilities for people, build infrastructure for people, make sure that the healthcare is working and nobody has to like pay a lot for it. And all of these sort of like things that people actually want, that in countries where like United States is mainly, where there's like sort of predominant philosophy of like, we don't want to be paying taxes, then like even the taxes that are collected in that country somehow are often misspent. And then we have like a big argument against government in that sense, that like, look at how poorly the government is spending the money. So here it doesn't seem to be, or like in the Scandinavia, it doesn't actually, or Germany, it doesn't seem to be, even though the taxes are relatively high, it doesn't seem to be, or there isn't objectively as much resentment because of it. Like it is not like a actual deterrent to people like from doing business that much. And it's not clear that if you've decreased all those taxes a lot, that there will be any sort of corresponding like, and suddenly the industrialists will make a lot more of better stuff for everyone, or at least people here would be skeptical of that change.
Well, the final side to that, before I jump into the AFFEERCE stuff a little more. So the final side is the difference between, the wealth kind of controlling all the capital, the wealthy people, let's call them the 1% or the 0.1%, the billionaires, getting more and more and more power because they own more and more land, more and more companies, more and more resources. And they basically, little by little, enslave everybody else and exploit them and pay very little tax in most cases because they have ways to hide it. And the middle class kind of gets pushed down over time, and the ultra elite kind of profits. So that's the other part of taxes, where you're really trying to find ways to kind of counterbalance that at least a little bit, where whether it's some kind of wealth tax or some kind of, again, land tax, that kind of pushes that down so that people at the bottom can have a chance to kind of at least get to the bare minimum, which is something we've talked a lot about as far as a basic income, or some way to help the people on the bottom not fall through the cracks and not turn to crime and horrible lives and many other problems that come with that.
Sure. I just, now that you've said that, I think if you factor in some sort of planned changes like basic income given to people, then in those scenarios, like you can actually make a good case even to socialists that income tax doesn't like no longer make sense, because it's the government giving you the money that then you give them back. It's like, then it's sort of, that's the sort of scenario in which it's clearly getting ridiculous. And then some sort of other mathematical solution would make more sense.
I think it's definitely clear that we want some form of government to control pollution, to provide infrastructure like roads, provide education to some extent anyway. Healthcare, of course, in most of the world is provided from taxes. So I think the majority of people worldwide, let's say 80, 90% plus, kind of agree that we want some form of taxes, and some form of government to help us control these commons and give these common resources to everybody. So let's not argue or worry too much about the fact that we want some taxes. Let's just, the goal here is trying to figure out what's the best kind of taxes for a global society. So if we're going to try to save the world, if we're going to try to find things that could work for every country, how could we go about collecting taxes on a global level and distributing them globally? We've talked about that a little bit before with some of our ideas. But this AFFEERCE thing is one of the biggest books out there that I've found recently that's very similar to our kind of World Bank mentality of collecting all the resources and distributing them all. So let me just take a few minutes and I'll walk you through it, and then we'll dig in a bit deeper, some of the problems or potential issues. I'm going to try to share a screen here, see if it works. I've never actually tried that before here. But let's, for the first time, we're going to go and we'll share a window. Tell me if you can see it okay, Martin.
Let's hope it won't break the stream.
Let's hope it won't break the stream. If it does, we'll learn our lesson. But here's the, can you see it?
Yes.
It's a website. Okay, so here's the basic plan. It's a little busy. There aren't too many people involved in it yet. But the basic AFFEERCE in a nutshell right here, and the basic idea that kind of led me towards it. Number one, buy up all the land in the world into a binding trust, because I always saw land as a shared resource. No one should really own the land. If I think back to Pocahontas, you think you own whatever land you land on, but you don't. It's really a shared resource of the world. We share it with the animals as well, but at the end of the day, it's the commons. Everything we get, the water, the air, the earth, the soil, it's the common resource. So you can never really own it. You're always paying somebody to kind of manage it. So that's number one, is pull it back from the 1% that are slowly buying up all our world and enslaving us and pushing people into smaller and smaller areas because they own all the land. We got to somehow buy it back from them into some kind of binding trust, and then rent each property. Don't sell. We rent each property again to the highest bidder to get the most value for it. Whether it's commercial, residential, or mining land, whatever it might be, you rent it over time, following specific policies to ensure that they don't ruin it or wreck it. but also at the same time give it to the highest bidder that can produce the most value from that land, the most value to society from using that particular plot of land, rent it to that person. And if somebody else comes along and bids significantly higher, you find ways to give it to that person and balance it around. So no one ever really owns any land. They do still own like the property on that land, and there's things we'll talk about as we get deeper, maybe if we have time. But the point is that the land is owned by everyone, and then the third main part is distribute all those rents collected essentially to every person on Earth. And you might have a certain percentage of it go to the governments of the Earth to provide education, healthcare, roads, and stuff. But the rest, whatever is left, hopefully most of it, goes to everybody equally on Earth to use however they want as their share of the commons. So what do you think about that? As a 1, 2, 3, does it kind of make sense?
Well, it looks like what they actually did in Star Trek, but never explained, kinda, or something like this. I just don't see necessarily the connecting points between this. Feels a bit extreme between this state and our current state. Like, how would you exactly like get from here to there? Because I think like some of these are like so huge sticking points. Like not owning the land you're on, that's such a huge sticking point to libertarians. Like such an extreme invasion from their point of view, especially like for the Ayn Randists and people like that. It's that would be like they would like die over it, like literally, like it was with the gun and like what they believe is their land and defending from like the government drones and stuff.
That's the most interesting part about this, and I want to talk a little bit about it. There's phase 1, 2, and 3, whole bunch of different books here.
I just
I'll just kind of go through them very briefly.
I also do have some comments on the other steps. I just think like that one is like an extreme sticking point of people like for liberty or against liberty, I guess. The other one, like highest bidder and like distributing the rents equally to people. Like the last part, like, okay, we discussed stuff like that. That's not really the problem. I think the problem would be with the highest bidder thing when you basically said the word value, because that really depends on like a strict definition, or like how exact is your definition of what's the value you're supposed to be getting in that equation. Because of course, highest bidder normally would mean highest possible exploitation. So without like strict environmental protections and stuff, like regulation, like a whole bunch of regulation, highest bidder would be land wrecking. And then you have these like externalities that if you wreck land somewhere, you're wrecking the people living on it. So like, I guess at the very least, if you're distributing some sort of rent to them, like close to maybe like in Alaska, how it is, then like, sure, the land's being exploited, but like at least like the people who are being damaged or like whose land is being damaged by the exploitation are getting like enough money back to like deal with whatever problems it might cause. So sure, that's like definitely better than exploiting the heck out of it and then just not giving even like anything at all to the local people. It's just yeah, I would just be like two sticking points. Like I would like one sticking point would be like buying up all the land so that nobody owns land. I think that's a bit extreme, because you could do like move toward in that direction a lot, but still like let some people who just want to own their own parcel of land to be able to without disrupting the system. I guess this is mostly about big mining operations and stuff, or agriculture.
Absolutely. Let me stop you there for a sec, though. So I agree. And the point is that when you kind of get deeper into it, it kind of explains that people will be happy to sell their land, because we'll be offering such a good price for it, theoretically, to buy it into the commons. So everybody's going to be super happy. Like even libertarians, like say they're offered 2 or 3 times the value of their land, and now they can go and rent some yacht or some super nice land somewhere else. Even though they don't actually own the land, they'll have tons of money to rent land for life pretty much anywhere in the world.
Sure.
So I think that's kind of the concept.
I was talking about principled libertarians.
Understood.
Like Randists.
Yeah, but I think that's the point, is that if you do it right, and they can still own property, or they can still own like items and houses on the land. They can still own that, and there's tricks on how to do that. How do you sell land without selling the property on the land, or let's call it the additions to the land? And so that's some very big distinctions there that are very tricky and fairly complicated. And that's part of the issues I have. I've had a lot of big questions, but you zeroed on the exact same question that I had about the pollution as well. You definitely do need very strict pollution regulations to ensure they're not over exploiting that land beyond what can be, so they just rent it temporarily, exploit it for a few months or a few years, and then stop renting it. That's obviously very bad, and we definitely need to make sure there's good regulations and good oversight that keeps that from happening. And again, very tricky, complicated to do, but I think it's possible in the same way we're kind of doing it now, as long as you have various forms, various levels of government kind of watching it.
No, I would say one thing. I said, if you sort of achieved this, then I would be basically like Star Trek level future type stuff, economic relations on the planet. I'm not saying it's necessarily the end point would be terrible. I'm just sure there will be people who be like like terrorists against people who are trying to accomplish this, like to the death defending the principles of liberty or something. There would still definitely be some. And in the world of Star Trek, there are like rogues and criminals or whatever. So there are people who are principally opposed to the Federation. It just the solution then in the future is, if we're talking strictly about the Earth, then the solution for the freedom people, like in Star Trek, is to pack up their stuff and move to some other planet to like colonize a place where they will own the land. So in the future, I guess there are mitigating factors to like our solutions, because in the Star Trek, that's basically how it happened with all the factions that didn't want to be Federation, who were humans, basically just took their stuff and found like a moon or a planet somewhere else, or built a station under their own leadership rules. So that's one thing. But also, I think it definitely could be doable if it was presented more like, first of all, that's like sort of a direction in which to move. And then like you could have like achieve even a high percentage of like the land on Earth being operated in this way. It's just because if an individual wants to have individual land, then it's basically like, I want to own the land upon which my house stands specifically. I don't need to own like a forest or like a mountain range or like a big field. And secondly, I think there is a philosophical way, how environmental, ecological, philosophical way how to look at it that sort of explains why it's not crazy, and that's but it's very different to the Western culture, and that's the sort of like you've mentioned Pocahontas, but it's actually these kinds of philosophies of some of the peoples, because of course you shouldn't simplify them that like all of them were environmentalists or whatever. Some of them were like very pro-Western in their mentality before encountering West, but like some of these are very like living in harmony with the earth, that like you should think of yourself as a steward of the land, not as an owner. And basically being the steward is like not being the owner, but being the steward, depending on what rights you have because of that, is like, could be for you, you wouldn't notice the difference other than it's a different concept or it's called something else. But basically just with the understanding that it's not necessarily like for you to be like controlling, like for your, I don't know, family, like being controlling the same piece of land for generations necessarily, because you just own it, like regardless of how good or bad they are as stewards of the land. There could be a factor of like, I could say like value, again, depending on how you define it, meaning that like you sort of have to do like something to be a good steward, that like in order to be able to maintain the status.
Absolutely. And you said pretty much everything I wanted to say as far as the things you got to be careful of. And just to clarify again, that we'd never force anyone to sell their land, theoretically. I mean, at some point, depending if the whole world, if there's just a 1% holdout, maybe at some point we might. But throughout the whole process, it's just about buying little bits at a time and basically just growing little by little by little, and then offering maybe more and more just to get more and more land into it. And everybody who kind of joins, let's call it the guild or the union or whatever mentality you want to call the family, the AFFEERCE family, they would all get a certain distribution based on the rent going out from it. So it's like, as long as you're paying less than a certain amount for rent than what you're getting in the distribution, you actually come out ahead. And it's like you're getting free land. You know, if you're just buying a small plot and you can easily rent that with your distribution, then they're actually just giving you money. And, you know, it's a very kind of a win-win situation. You don't necessarily have to own land to live really well on good land.
No, I do understand that like it would be set up in a way that it would be incentivizing the shift for people, and many people would just economically rationally follow the incentive, and you could even achieve like a 99% just like through this mechanism. I just wouldn't necessarily mind that there is a 1% holdout.
And I think for the most part, I wouldn't mind either. It just depends on whether they're trying to attack people, right? And that's where it comes down to militarily defending your land. And there's definitely parts of that are rolled into this as well. But ideally, we want people to compete for land by offering higher rents. You know, and it's this process called trebling, which means to triple the rent someone is currently paying. That's the way you can kind of conquer their land somehow is by offering to triple it. You can't just go up incrementally. You have to actually triple it temporarily, and then it goes down 10 or 20% per year, some amount, so that eventually gets back to where it was. But in order to conquer someone's land, you've got to triple it and pay 133% of the cost of whatever's on that land. So the house or the business or whatever's on it, you got to pay like a premium for that and triple the rent. So it's actually pretty hard to kind of conquer someone's land economically. But it's basically kind of encourages them to pay, and the rent they're paying is essentially voluntary, just to keep someone else from conquering it.
Except that, again, I would maybe, that sort of seems like it should justify a distinction between like the land where you specifically have a house and live, so that somebody like under no circumstances can take away basically your place where you live. I think that's the sort of sticking point or the sort of breaking point of this whole model, because that would make people very upset, because clearly people with a lot of money are doing, to the extent to which they can do it, are doing it already, actually are trying to buy up everybody's houses and, well, the land around the houses, so that specifically the corporations now, like very wealthy interests, would love if all people would be just renting the houses and nobody would be owning their house, because of course they would do it so that they can be just like continuously increasing the price, like the amount of the rent that's being paid. And then there's also the additional problem is that like if you're doing it, like if you're gentrifying in this way a lot and like the rent goes very like high up, then you're even like just expelling like sort of undesirable people out of the location, which basically often means the actual long-time residents of the area who originally were there.
Agreed.
So yeah, I think that's in this whole model, I still think there would have to be some pretty significant protections of like specifically for people with a lot of money not to be, or in governments or interests with a lot of money not to be able to basically move people out from where they're living, like in terms of like their residence, like their actually house where a family lives.
I agree. And that is, again, it's a bit of a sticking point with me too. And I think the key concept is that they'll be getting so much extra in, compensation, like they'll get 133% of the value, plus the dividends of the rent from everybody in the world is sharing the rent. So if the rent costs go up, it means everyone's dividend goes up. So you'll always be able to find at least a relatively nice place to live, probably close by, if not right next door, or maybe even the same house. They'll just buy your house and you'll continue to rent it using your own dividend, and not much actually changes.
Sure, but the like whole necessity to move because of some sort of financial pressure is like something that's very offensive to a lot of
correct. And I agree, and there's definitely a lot of ways we can kind of prevent that. And that's never the goal, is to force someone to move. But if someone, for whatever reason, chooses to move, or it's economic, you're trying to make it economically viable or reasonable or economically good for them to move somewhere where it's good for them to live, where they'll be happy and have value and have a good opportunity.
It's also basically like the sort of ancient human thing. It's just like, I want to build a house that's my own and live there on my just like little piece of land. I think that's like so ingrained in many people that like you just can't create a system that will demolish it and like expect that people won't riot.
Agreed. Yeah, it's definitely tricky. Well, let me walk you through the phases super fast. So phase one is really just about buying a plot of land, say $20 million. You buy a few thousand acres somewhere, farmland or whatever, and you get maybe anywhere from 200 to 2,000 volunteers, essentially. Our first scenarios, they're called, part of the Guild of AFFEERCE, of the AFFEERCE Benefit Corporation, the ABC, is phase one. So get the money, buy the land, get these volunteers together, and each of the volunteers automatically, after working there for 6 months, gets like 80% of the land goes to the guild. 20% sticks with the investors, but most of the value produced there becomes owned by the guild and each member of the guild based on how many hours they work to build up that land, essentially. So that's kind of phase one, and it's a whole like 20-year period of basically building up that land and growing from those and recruiting more and more people into the guild, essentially, to develop the land and kind of start a whole new society almost, from scratch. It's a really neat idea. A lot of details there on the website. Fairly complicated, but kind of a neat idea. And I think many other, like the Venus Project, the One Community Global, Mark Lohr's Telosa in the U.S. A lot of these kinds of similar concepts are already kind of being done in different ways, and I'm fairly supportive of them. I think it's exciting. So this is just another one that I'd love to see at some point kick off in some fashion, so we can kind of learn from it and see how well it does do.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, you mentioned Venus Project. When we were describing it, I did immediately think of all of those like sci-fi setups. It's basically setting up like a sci-fi movie. It's just like, and somebody created this kind of community.
But yeah, so that's phase one. Phase two is the 20-year forward. That's when you start kind of creating your own virtual currency based on biometrics, VIP dollar it's called, where you start using that money, minting your own money to buy other people's land and bring as much land into the area as you can from all around the world, and basically just expand. And that's kind of where it gets interesting, because when you have your own currency and the currency is backed to the land value, so it's kind of, you only have currency based on what you're buying land with. So it's kind of supported that way. Whereas cryptocurrency today is not backed by anything really. It's just, and we see it now crashing. It's funny money, and it's basically the world's largest Ponzi scheme. We've talked about it before. Won't get much into it again today, but that's the whole idea. Is if you do have a cryptocurrency based on value, based on land or companies or some kind of tangible value, it could actually work really well, and you could replace all the world's currencies with it over time if people actually trusted it and kind of bought into it and said, yeah, I'll use that currency because it's backed by all the land that the ABC Corporation owns and the AFFEERCE Guild owns, and they're bringing more and more land in every year, and they're kind of expanding their influence. So that's the second phase. Phase two, buying up as much land as possible, and that goes on for about 20 years. And then I think the third phase is basically when you start distributing the basic income to essentially everybody in the world, little by little. You buy people buy into it, and they continue. It's called deluxe expansion, I think it's called. So it starts with just the guild, then moves out around the guild and starts buying up land with the dollars, and then it starts, trying to bring everybody into it and distributing the income to everyone in the world that joins up, essentially. Long 60-year process before the entire world kind of signs in, and the other part of it is the cellular democracy part, where everyone's kind of a sovereign, and we've talked a little bit about how you can kind of roll your vote up. 60 people make a level 1 cell, 690 people make a level 2 cell, level 3, whereas the whole world is level 9, essentially, and it keeps on going up and down. Neat concept, but that's basically how they would function on a governmental level, where everybody has a right to give up their sovereignty or take it back at any point to control, their government on their level and their family level, city level, nation level, and above. So some things get rolled up, some things get rolled down based on the 2/3 vote of whatever cell level is in control of it. So pretty interesting stuff. It's very deep, hundreds and hundreds of pages of detail there. Maybe we can talk about it more at some future one if there's something specific we want to talk about it. But I thought it was a really cool idea. I just wanted to share it with Martin and all our viewers. This is something to think about, something to kind of spur conversation and spur ideas on what the perfect world could look like, and how do we get from where we are now to where we'd want to be, where everybody has all the food, all the opportunity, all the healthcare and education that they could possibly want, provided for by the commons, the land, and the good resources. So I think that's all we have time for, mostly today. Martin, what do you think? Do you have any final comments about AFFEERCE specifically you'd like to throw out there?
Well, I guess like the stuff that you've described in the last 3 minutes would require another hour to comment on. So my brain started thinking about it. So I guess we don't have time for that now.
Yeah, maybe we'll dig into it more probably in the future. But I did think it was kind of in line with some of the ideas we've had about the World Bank and about taxing pollution, giving that tax back to everybody. This is just kind of a more specific way of doing it with land, and kind of starting, with this one city the city's called Prosperity. Where you just develop that prosperity city.
Very
so
sci-fi.
I'm looking forward to learning more about it. We'll see whether it kind of connects with us somehow. If there's any synergies we can kind of develop with this team trying to do this, or if they'll actually get the $20 million they need to actually make it happen. I'd be happy to invest some of my own money in an idea like this. So I'm pretty excited about it, and we'll see how it develops. I'll keep my ear to the ground and continue to study.